So as you've probably seen in a lot of the press releases, my talks titled Plants of the Marina Dunes, Adaptations, Climate Change, and You. And as mentioned in the introduction, my name is Cole Mefford, and I've been working for Return of the Natives, which is a plant restoration program at CSUMB for the last couple of years. And I've gotten a great opportunity to learn a lot about the native plants of the dunes where Ron does restoration work. And I'm nowhere close to the level of expertise as our previous speaker was, but I still am hoping to provide some valuable insight today. So I will get going. So first, it's important to get a good grip on where the actual dunes are. So historically, dunes were far more widespread in California than they are currently, and that's the case with a lot of habitats that have been restricted due to development and a lot of other factors. But dunes have been kind of reduced down to a smaller portion of California's coastline, and part of that portion is the southern portion of the Monterey Bay, which has a pretty significant amount of dune habitat. And in our local area, immediate local area, and near the Monterey Peninsula, dunes stretch from the mouth of the Salinas River south to where the wharf is, kind of like Del Monte Beach. And then there's also kind of another portion of dune habitat along the west coastline of the Monterey Peninsula, which is sort of made up by the Asilomar State Beach and a lot of the other public lands along that stretch. There's some minor differences between the dune habitats, and there's two separate locations. The one along the peninsula tends to be impacted by the runoff irrigation from the golf courses. So that slightly kind of alters the species you may see in that area. But for the most part, these dunes habitats are pretty similar. So what actually is a dune? So a dune is a type of ecosystem and habitat that is native to the immediate coastline of California. So dunes are the portion of the beach that is beyond the waterline and but still within reach of sea spray and ocean. So historically, dunes went farther inland than they do currently. So you may have a whole mile inland of dune habitat, whereas today you'll usually just have smaller slivers of it since of course habitat has been reduced. But anyways, this is a really unique zone that's really dynamic. It relies on a lot of different factors. The ocean and the atmosphere heavily influence the dunes and create a microclimate that is unique to this habitat and is pretty different from the surrounding areas. And a lot of the organisms that live in this habitat are specialized for the dunes. So they have adaptations that allow them to survive. And that's part of the focus of this whole talk is the adaptations in plant species. But as you can see in the image, there's other organisms that are pretty well adapted, like snowy plovers. And if you go to Del Monte Beach, you can find all kinds of critters in the dunes, western fence lizards, small mammals, all kinds of birds. And a lot of them spend most of their time, if not all their time, in the dune habitat. And this is kind of a double-edged sword because this means dunes are a lot more fragile to changes around them. So this is a list of plant species, which are kind of a good example of well-adapted plants to the environment. So this is a list of, around 10-ish, 9 or 10-ish native species that it can be pretty easily found in the dunes of the Monterey Bay, specifically in the southern Monterey Bay, so the Marina dunes, for example. So I won't go through all these, but you can see I've listed the common name and the scientific name, and I'll dive into some of these here. So the first one we'll look at is beach sagewort, and I've included the scientific name. I'm not going to go through each scientific name and try to pronounce them, but I've included them there. So this is beach sagewort. It's a type of Artemisia, which is a widespread genus in California. However, if you look on the range map on the left-hand side of this slide, you can see where the yellow and the little dots are. That represents the range of this species. So in California, you can see the range is pretty limited to the immediate coastline. And you'll see with the next few slides of different species, I've included the range map for each one so you can see how specialized this plant species is in terms of where it can live. So this one is native up past the California border with Oregon, and relatively it's a pretty drought tolerant plant, but it is sensitive to temperature extremes, and that's kind of an ongoing theme you'll see with a lot of the specialized plants is they are sensitive to extremes. So you can see I've included an image, and many of you may have seen this at the beach. It's slightly fragrant. You may be able to smell it a little bit. It's a close relative of the California sagebrush, which is very, very strong smelling, but isn't really found in the dunes. So this particular species is found in the dunes, and it grows to about 1.6 feet tall and 3 feet wide. So generally it's wider. It's more wide than it is tall. And that's, again, an ongoing theme you'll see with these dune plants. So another one, sea thrift. And also an important note with some of these plants that I'm listing out, this isn't just like a big long list of plants that you'll find only in the dunes. A lot of these are really well adapted to our local area, so they'll sort of crop up wherever they can in our local community where there's the habitat to provide for them. So in Marina, if you're going along Reservation Road, in any sort of sandy little lot on the side of the road, you may see a lot of these species because they're so well adapted to our local area. So this is one, actually, sea thrift. It's used a lot in irrigated landscapes and drought tolerant landscapes in our area. Sea thrift. It has a lot of common names. So you may hear me say sea pink, sea thrift. Usually, California Native Plant Resources will refer to it as sea thrift or just thrift, but people call it all kinds of names. But anyways, this is a species that you'll see all over Carmel, all over Marina, all over Sand City, Seaside. It's just a really widespread one. Although the range map shows it living immediately along the coast, people use this plant in landscaping actually all across the state, but it tends to thrive best immediately along the coast. Again, it's a species that's really well adapted to our immediate coastline in California. And even specifically in these range maps, if you look closely, south of San Jose, you'll see our home, the Monterey Bay. And a lot of these species you'll see are really well concentrated in the Monterey Bay, which just goes to show how important our local community is to a lot of these plant species. So another one, and this is one that I kind of want to focus on because this one is actually very, very common in the Marina dunes. So this is yellow sand verbena, and there's multiple species of verbena that you'll find at the beach. There's also a purplish pink variety that you can find, but this one is arguably the most common one you'll find in the Marina dunes. So the yellow sand verbena is one that spreads horizontally along the ground. So we imagine plants as they grow up towards the sun, but a lot of the plants in the dunes, one of their main adaptations is they grow along the ground. So they grow completely flat. And part of what is beneficial in the dune environment is that since the dune environment is so dynamic and it's always shifting, it literally is just loose sand that's being blown around by wind, that's being shifted by human forces, whether it's development or just foot traffic, whether it is wave action, whether it's rain. The dunes are constantly shifting in shape, height, size, with, the dunes are always moving. So plants that can grow horizontally really do thrive in that environment, because if a bunch of sand gets blown up directly almost on top of the plant, it can just continue to grow along the surface and avoid being buried. So, and this also helps with erosion control. So as these plants grow horizontally, they tend to root as they continue. And you can see in this image, this is actually an image I just took this last Wednesday at Marina State Beach. You can really see that horizontal growth habit. So it's just growing flat along the ground. And in that initial image, and I can actually just go back to it super quick at the beginning, you can see the majority of the plant species in this image. The main one is that yellow sand verbena, and you can see how much it grows. A lot of these came from one initial plant and spread, 5-6 feet wide. So these are really important plants in regards to in maintaining that shape in the dunes and preventing that sand from just being wind blown onto the freeway or onto other roadways. So saltgrass is an important species, and this is actually one that is way more widespread in our area. This you can find in the Elkhorn Slough. You can find this all over. I actually just moved down to this area from the San Francisco Bay Area, and saltgrass was easily the most common plant species all around my area. It was just, growing everywhere. And there's a reason why, and it's that it's really drought tolerant and it tolerates salinity. And that's another adaptation that helps it survive along the coast. Obviously, you can see in the range map, it can do well all over, but it helps that it can tolerate salinity, because in these coastal conditions, it can really thrive and tolerate that salt, where other grass species or even just other plant species may not be able to handle that. And this is, again, another one that, since it spreads horizontally, and this is actually a species that it doesn't just send out leaves and branches on the surface or stems, it can actually spread underneath the sand and really stabilize it from below. So saltgrass is just a really important species, and those underground rhizomes that spread underneath the sand, those can spread for 10, 15, 30 feet. That grass can continue growing underneath and spreading and taking root and stabilizing those dunes. And it's important to note that a lot of these are also really critical to different wildlife species. So they provide food, shelter, nesting material, whatever it may be. A lot of these species, since they've co-evolved with that wildlife, they rely on each other, whether the plant relies on the animal for dispersing its seed, or the animal relies on it for food, or whatever it may be. There's a lot of interconnected relationships between these plants in this presentation and the wildlife that we see in our local community. And now this is actually my favorite species that you may find in the dunes, and this is beach suncup, also called beach primrose. It has a lot of common names, but this is just a really neat one. It's another one of those prostrate, horizontal growth type of plants where it'll germinate, grow and develop itself a little bit, and then just spread really far to the side, and that also helps with stabilization of the dunes. This is a really pretty one. It has these tiny, probably about the size of a penny, maybe a little bigger flowers, these little yellow flowers that really attract a wide range of pollinators and also produce seeds that birds will eat. And again, if you look at these range maps, this is another one of those species that really can only live in that immediate coastline along the California coast. And again, the Monterey Bay, you can see, is a stronghold for this species. And this is just, again, one of those plants that can totally tolerate being buried by shifting sand and can continue to grow up through that sand and again stabilize those dunes like a lot of these other species. Seaside Daisy, this is a really beautiful one. It's really, again, common immediately along the coast. This photo I took this last Wednesday, also at Marina State Beach. You can see it's just a prolific flowering plant. It's just a beautiful plant overall. But similar to a lot of these other species, it only grows to about a foot tall. So it stays, relatively short, but it can really clump and spread out side to side. And that, again, is an adaptation that helps a lot of these plants survive in this high wind environment. So since the dunes are so open, there's not that many trees providing, cover from wind. There's really high wind conditions. And as a result, these plants have learned to kind of stay short, stay compact, and avoid getting blown over and snapping and whatnot. So Seaside Daisy, again, just a really neat species that is found in our dunes and is really important to wildlife. And then this is the last plant I'm going to kind of dive into specifically, and then we'll talk more generally about the adaptations and how they help. But this is my personal favorite of the dunes, and this is the Monterey Indian paintbrush, which a lot of people locally know. It has a strong cultural value in California. And one interesting note about it is that it's a parasitic plant, which I'm sure everyone in this call probably already knows. It's a widely known fact in our area that they are a plant that attaches its roots to another plant and will pull nutrients from that plant's root system and be completely reliant on that plant. And what's interesting is this is a plant that is a perennial. It's one that can continue to grow year after year after year. So this is a plant that is really able to fully mature and develop, completely sucking off of another plant. And I won't get into the details of it because there's a lot of species of paintbrush, and some of them rely on specific hosts. Some of them can sometimes function on their own, but generally they're parasitic and they're highly specialized to be able to pull nutrients out of the other dune plants. So in other words, this is a plant that relies entirely on the other plants that you've seen in the slideshow so far. So this is a plant that may only be able to attach to Seaside Daisy, for example, or sea cliff buckwheat. These are specific plant relationships where this plant can really only attach to the specific plants that are found with it in nature. So it's, again, limited by where its host plant can live. And you can see, again, in the range map, this is another one that is really native to that immediate coastline. And it's another one that stays short, bushy, like a lot of the other dune plants. So climate change, of course, is something that's been widely discussed so far in these talks and just generally in society. And this is something that's going to, yes, impact the dunes. So decreased rainfall and more wave action is definitely going to alter how the dunes continue to develop, and it'll probably lead to erosion. That's what most of the experts agree, that erosion is going to be a big problem in the dunes going forward. So again, a lot of these plants are going to be really critical in helping mitigate that risk because they reduce erosion by being able to root in. But yeah, sea level rise, more wave action, and just altered weather patterns in general are going to really influence this highly dynamic environment, and likely make it maybe a more harsh environment to live in for a lot of these species. And you can see these are just two little pictures I got off of the drought.gov website, showing that 100% of Monterey County is in severe drought, and a smaller portion of Monterey County is in extreme drought. So these are very real things happening right now that are currently having impacts. But like we've discussed so far, a lot of these species are tolerant of intense wind. They're tolerant of drought. They're tolerant of these conditions. But another common thread is that they're sensitive to really far extremes on any side of the spectrum in terms of weather. So these plants are adapted to survive in these changing conditions, but they're still sensitive to extremes, and we'll probably see certain species grow more, certain species grow less, and maybe certain species disappear entirely as this continues to change. This can be a dark topic to discuss, but it's also really important to discuss that we totally play a role in this process, and that we can help build that resiliency of these dunes. So we can take part in dune restoration, and that's part of what Ron does. Is we go out to the dunes and we'll plant plants, and we'll remove invasive ones, plant new ones, and fence areas off, and take part in this dune restoration. But it's important that we're all on board for the same mission, so that we can all work towards the same goal of healthy and happy dunes. So it's highly encouraged that people in our community, including those on this call, take part in restoration events or monitoring events. There's people going out constantly monitoring how these plants are growing, how well they're doing. People going out regularly to plant, and of course things are different because of COVID and the pandemic situation. But ideally, plantings will return soon and provide everyone an opportunity to get involved. But yeah, these are really important events. You can see I've included an image on the right-hand side of actually a Return of the Natives planting event in the Marina Dunes. And it's always a great deal of fun, always beautiful out there. Just a great opportunity to help restore some of these dunes, because these plants they've evolved to survive in this environment, and with a little help from us, we can really help them thrive in these conditions. And building on that, our involvement in the dunes is a big influence on how the dunes develop, whether it's a good development, bad development, whether they get degraded or whether they increase in health. So there's a lot of nuances to human involvement in the dunes, but in general, here are some things that we need to consider: is that human foot traffic. That's arguably one of the biggest influences on the dunes as of today. So people walking up in the dunes, people walking off designated trails. These are things that can really do a lot of damage to a dune, and that's something to be mindful of, because these small little plants, they are not super fast growing plants. These dune plants, they can take decades to mature and to really give that full benefit of erosion control. And if we're trampling through the dunes and killing these plants or pulling the vegetation out, then they don't have that opportunity to really take root and provide those benefits to wildlife and to our community. And that's why we should really try to avoid, going into areas of the dunes that are specifically, portioned off. There, you'll see signs like closed to entry, like this one, or you'll see all kinds of different little fence apparatuses to keep people out. And it's important to respect these, because these are truly sensitive areas. You saw on the range maps of all the species on the California coast, this is a very narrow sliver of habitat that a lot of species really, really rely on. So it's important that we do everything we can to preserve this really narrow and disappearing type of habitat in California. And one last thing that is also kind of a sensitive and nuanced topic is dogs. So it's important to not bring dogs to areas where it specifically says not to. So you'll see signs that say dogs prohibited because it's endangered species area. You'll see snowy plovers, whether it's an endangered plant species, animal species. Again, these are sensitive areas, and we want to be mindful of that. So always be cautious of the signs. If they say no dogs allowed, maybe take your dog to the dog park that day instead. Or if it says just keep dogs on leash, great, bring your dog to the beach, have a great day, but just keep them on leash. These are just small little things that we can really, that'll make a big difference So yeah, but final takeaways, if we can stay on those trails, that'll really help, avoid pulling out vegetation, even if we're thinking, oh, this one may be a weed, this one may be native. If you don't really know, it's best to not pull anything out, because you could be pulling out a native plant. So leave the vegetation as is, and keep the dogs in the dog park, or keep them on leash. Yep, and that's it for me. So that was a kind of a short talk, but I hope it provided some helpful insight to understanding our local dunes. And I just really appreciate everyone taking the time to tune in today and listen to this talk, and also for the opportunity to do this. This was just such a great opportunity, and I'm very grateful to be here today. So thank you so much.